to imagine that we're about 100 years ago, 1940, okay? And there's a war, and the war is really popular, okay? So everybody is going to fight, the men are going to fight, the women are knitting socks for the soldiers, and everybody thinks it's a good thing, all right? But there's a group of women in Manchester who don't think it's a good thing. They want people to think about war. They want them to think that war is a good way to solve disputes, all right? So lots of Unitarians. Oh, fantastic. So these women get together, they get themselves organised, and they're fighting. I use that word deliberately to get people to think about why we make war and how we can make peace. And what they're really interested in is how are we going to make a peace at the end of the war that will stop another war. All right. So it's a win. We call it now a win-win situation. I don't think they had that language then. Okay. So this has been things I've interested in, and what I discovered that in this area, Withington, there was a little group of people who were supporting each other, and they were people who were against the war. So I found some of their houses, and I thought we could go and look at them and talk about them. Is that okay? So this is the picture on the front is the Women's International League. It still exists. It's called the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And these were women that went at the end of the First World War to try and persuade the governments of Europe to make a peace that would prevent another war. They didn't do that because we know we had the Civil War. And this is my favourite woman, which we're going to talk about just here on the left, and she's called Margaret Ashton, and she was a Unitarian, and she was the first woman councillor. By the outbreak of the First World War, she's about 50, and she makes a stand for this, and as a result she had lots of bad things happen to her, like they threw her off the council, people probably spat at her in the street here, I don't know. They were all involved in the anti-war campaigns, and there were links between them, they all knew each other, okay? So it's a kind of, I think it's quite interesting because we don't really know whether they would meet at the shops or anything like that, but we can imagine that would be the case, all right? So some of the women, there are women and men, some of the women were involved in this organisation called the Women's International League. Some were involved in something called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a lot of Unitarians and Quakers, and they're a kind of radical Christian group that were just not prepared to take part. That were not prepared to take part in war at all right? They weren't prepared to do anything.
Might be of interest to the rest of you that the Unitarians and the Quakers are both the same groups behind the passing into the House of Lords the amendment that allows civil partnerships to take place in houses of worship, which means that the religions that allow same-sex marriage are allowed to perform it in their churches now, which includes mine, so it's shiny.
Yeah. So they are radical groups. This thing called the No Conscription Fellowship, what you have to think in the First World War is that they didn't have enough people to fight. So they relied on people joining, men to join up. And when there weren't enough men, they passed a law that said you had to join up, okay? And so this was the point at which people who had a strong faith, who really didn't believe in war, had to stand up and say, we're not prepared to go and fight. And these people were then generally put in prison.
I heard that there was a group of people who were like conscientious objectors, so to do war, but in a different way, like not actually fight that to help.
Well, these are them, the conscientious objectors.
It's pretty much written into the Quaker religion that, they are pacifists.
Yes.
And they are against war in any form as much as they can.
But the interesting thing, Haley, no, it's absolutely true. The interesting thing is there were some people who said we're not even prepared to do anything, because by doing anything we'll support the war. And those people were treated very badly in prison, and quite a lot of them died. So you also have people who are on the left politically, people who are in the sort of Labour Party, and people who are campaigning for trade union things for women, because you have to remember, as the men went to fight, a lot of the women were then absorbed into the factories to make the bombs, to make the guns, to make the shells. Okay? This is the house of Frank Merrick and his wife Hope, and he was a professor of music at the university, and his wife was a singer, and she was part of the suffrage movement, so she was involved in campaigning for the vote. You know, that women at that time couldn't vote, and so she was part of that. Movement. Frank was a conscientious objector. We've got something in the back here, which is an article from the Guardian. You don't have to look at it now, but it tells you he refused to put on khaki, and he was imprisoned. So this is where they lived. We don't know very much about them. All these have been kind of gleaned from reading newspapers and minutes of meetings and things like that. So here they lived, and you can imagine they used to run art sales of works of art to raise money for the suffrage movement and things like that. So they're quite lively people, and this is their house. This is the home of the Reverend William Whitaker, and he was a Unitarian minister. He was at Platt Chapel. He was a pacifist. He was against the war, but he was also very supportive of the suffrage movement. And when we go and see a house of a young woman called Kate Woolworth, when she was accused of doing some damage as a suffragette, he was prepared to be a character witness for her and stick up for her. So this is William Whitaker. Hugh and Amy Herford, and they were involved in lots of the kind of progressive campaigns about trade unionism. Amy Herford was involved in setting up the Women's International League in Manchester, and they were both involved in the suffrage campaigns. I think Hugh Herford didn't become a conscientious objector because he was too old to be called up, okay? But if you look at the back, right at the back, you'll see this list on the back is a list of the No Conscription Fellowship set up a maintenance committee, because if you were a conscientious objector, you didn't get any money from the state. Quite often you were sacked from your job for being unpatriotic, and actually you had no money. So they set up this committee where people would put money in, donate money, so that families had enough money to live on. I mean, we don't know any of this, do we? We're not taught any of this in our history. So if you look here, you can see that the treasurer was Hugh Herford, who lived at 47 Parsonage Road, and here he was. So they would meet regularly, and lots of people would come together and donate money, which then they would hand out to people to make sure they didn't starve. There's quite a few minutes of meetings where they say, we're not going to tell you who was there because we don't want people to know. So increasingly as the war went on, people were quite frightened of being found out. We know that people were watched. We know that telephones were tapped. We know that people felt very uneasy about whether they might be imprisoned. So Hugh Herford. I see the house for sale. I better buck up.